So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. I'm thrilled to inaugurate the next book in our reading group, the virtual reading group, Hannah Arendt Center Virtual Reading Group. We're reading On Revolution. This is one of my all-time, really absolute favorite books. And there's currently a project being run that Bard is associated with um, to create a new Gesamtausgabe, a critical edition of Hannah Arendt's work in two languages, English and German. And this is the book that I chose to edit on revolution. So it's not due for 10 years. I haven't started uh, too much work on it yet, but it's a book I teach regularly and find to be in many ways her most important book in the current climate. We just finished reading, for many of us, On Revolution, Origins of Totalitarianism. And that's the book that gets a lot of attention, and it rightly should. It's an amazing book. But in many ways, if we're really interested in her thoughts about the contemporary political climate and what the challenges and what the hopes are for it, while totalitarianism is a problem, and totalitarianism is, as she said, the metric through which we should now be judging all political events, the the chance that totalitarianism is really going to reemerge is still, I think, slim. Some places it may, and different variations. This is a lot of what we talked about over the reading group. A lot of variations on it may emerge, but the bigger threat from her perspective is not full-on totalitarianism. It's something like the loss of freedom, and that is in many ways what totalitarianism is. It's the full-on loss of freedom. It's the total domination, the end of spontaneity. And someone's sharing your screen, so yes, thank you. And in that sense, On Revolution, which is a book about revolutions, but as such is really a book about freedom, is the book that really does speak to our contemporary predicament. Because what this book is trying to do is make an argument that, first, revolutions are about freedom. They're about, on the one hand, liberating ourselves from tyrannical or authoritarian regimes, but not just about that. Freedom is not just liberation. It's not just civil rights. It's not just being free to move around. It's the freedom to govern ourselves, to participate, to act and speak in public in a way that matters and is meaningful. And without that full freedom, we're not talking about freedom, we're talking about other things. And that's what she comes to see revolutions to be about. Now, obviously, there are some revolutions that may aim at other things. And that's actually part of her argument, is that while she looks at the French and the American Revolution and says, both at the beginning, both the American and the French revolutions said they were about freedom and articulated this idea of freedom. In the end, she thinks that the French Revolution abandons its concern with freedom and elevates other concerns above freedom, namely the will of the people and also the social question, the idea of social justice. And she thinks that that revolutionary tradition in France has, to the detriment of other revolutions, become the dominant understanding of what revolutions do around the world, and that as other revolutions around the world have emerged, they've followed the French model and not the American model, and have therefore not succeeded in founding freedom. And what this means is that for her, there's and this is something that a lot of us are going to have interesting reactions to. There's a kind of American exceptionalism in this book, um, and uh, and we need to take that seriously and also question it. But let me just say in advance, the argument of the book is that the constitutional Republican federal political tradition that emerged in America, beginning with the colonies and then the Constitution and then the politics, for Hannah Arendt, lasts somewhere till about the early to mid 20th century. And if we skip ahead, you guys haven't gotten there yet, but the last chapter of the book is called The Lost Treasure, or the Revolutionary Tradition and Its Lost Treasure. And part of the argument of that chapter is that the American, the exceptionalist American idea of freedom as it's emerged in the revolutionary tradition has been lost. Now, is it lost permanently? Can it be reborn? These are not questions she engages in this book. But in a number of interviews and essays that she publishes or engages in the 1960s, this book was written between 1958 and 1962. It's published in 1963. In a number of interviews and discussions she has in the late 1960s and even into the early 1970s, she keeps coming back to this question about whether the lost tradition, the American tradition of revolutionary freedom, can be reborn. And it's not one that I think she has a final decision on. So this is not there's not an argument that America is today an exceptional country or not. It's to say that the American founding moment, for a whole host of reasons, was unique in the world. And it had advantages and it had huge disadvantages. The primary disadvantage being slavery, which she talks a fair bit about in this book. But what she says is, for all of its disadvantages, it had certain advantages, which led the American model of government, the constitutional model of government that emerged, to be unique in the world and to be uniquely appropriate and conducive, not just to liberty, not just to democracy, but to freedom. And that this form of government that emerged in 18th century America, or say 18th century America and into 19th century America, was the one of the most free and institutionally protected and secured ideas of free government that had ever emerged in history, and that this is a tradition of the American Revolution, and it needs to be taken seriously, or it will be lost forever. At the root of that tradition are ideas of self-government, participation, federalism, and a whole host of others that we will be talking about as we read this book. And she will be countering that and opposing that to the way that the French Revolution didn't engage in these questions. And instead of federalism, the French government embraced a kind of centralism of the nation and the people of France. And instead of freedom as its core, the French Revolution embraced an idea of social justice and the social question. And instead of participation, the French were born about didn't have these institutions of participation and were more governed by a kind of elite central governance. And these are core issues that Arendt is going to use to develop her idea of what revolutionary freedom and the tradition of revolutionary freedom is in this book. I think some of you will have already noticed that many of these issues and questions are deeply relevant to politics today, both in the United States and elsewhere, about elite versus local governance, about federalism versus centralism, the social question versus freedom, the people and democracy versus federalism. These are huge questions in the United States. These are questions I think around the world today. And to me, this is the book. This is her last published book, right? There's a book called Life of the Mind, which has been edited by Mary McCarthy. It was never finished by Arendt. This was the last book she wrote. And it's in many ways her most mature political commentary, expressing her thoughts about politics. It's published the same year as Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is another great book, but not so much directed on politics as this one. And so for those of us interested in what Arendt has to say about politics and our world, this is really the book for us to focus on. And I'm excited to spend the next 3 or 4 months reading it with you. This first little introduction that we read for today, called War and Revolution, is very short. I thought maybe we could just read it and the next chapter all at once, but I decided, no, let's take it easy. Let's start small and give you guys a chance to ask questions, to have a discussion, and begin to frame some of the questions that we're going to be talking about in the book. I hope you've had a chance to listen to to watch the introduction that I recorded. I'm happy to go over some of the issues. I'll say that the main thrust of the introduction is that revolution has some very important similarities to war, right? One of which is they're both violent and destructive. And in the 20th century and now 21st century, given the technologies we have, including nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and technological weapons, the potential violence and destructiveness is extraordinary. And so she says, the old justifications for war, right, that you would go to war for booty or you'd go to war for advantage, just sort of become insane. I mean, yeah, okay, you can fight like a little skirmish on the border, but who's going to go to war over a territory, an island in the South Pacific or an island in the Chinese Sea, when it might mean the destruction of the human race? You'd have to be sort of insane. And that's in a sense why, we worry about insane leaders around the world, all around the world today. War has become, in many senses, a matter of existence, as has revolutions. And thus, freedom, she says, has become the only thing that can really justify war. And that ties war to revolution, such that today, all wars become, in a sense, revolutionary wars. You wouldn't go to war unless it's for a kind of existential claim of freedom. And so that's the question. She raises this side question, which is actually something she talks about in a lot of her books, about what does this mean for war? Will war disappear? And, this is a question that a lot of people have asked. She's one of the first. Obviously, wars have not disappeared in the 50 years since she wrote this book, and yet we haven't had another world war, right? We haven't had another kind of existential war, and that's part of her argument. She raises this question about wars may become virtual wars. It's an interesting idea. The rise of drones and drone warfare, I think, is part of this, that we increasingly are going to fight wars in which it's not states and human beings that are being killed, but machines fighting machines, as a way to limit the damage that war can actually cause. And then she ends with this very pregnant metaphor at the end of this little section on beginnings and the state of nature. And she argues that The state of nature, which of course no one who ever wrote about it actually thought ever existed, is a kind of metaphor for a non-political realm, a realm that is before politics emerge, and um, and its relevance for her, as she says at the end of this chapter, says its relevance even today lies in the recognition that a political realm does not automatically come into being wherever men live together, and that there exists events which, though they may occur in a strictly historical context, are not really political and perhaps not even connected with politics. The notion of a state of nature alludes at least to a reality that cannot be comprehended by the 19th century idea of development, no matter how we may conceive of it, whether in the form of cause and effect, or of potentiality and actuality, or of a dialectical movement, or even a simple coherence and sequence in occurrences. For the hypothesis of a state of nature implies the existence of a beginning that is separated from everything following it, as though by an unbridgeable chasm. So those of you who've read The Human Condition and some of her other works will recognize some of this language, the idea of a beginning, a newness, something spontaneous. And there's a way in which revolutions make a claim to such a beginning, not simply to a series of events, a development, but actually the emergence of something new. And in that sense, the violence that we associate with the state of nature is also part of the violence that is, in a sense, the necessary part of revolutions. It's about a cleansing and a starting anew. And that's part of what she finds in revolutions. And so she can say whatever brotherhood human beings may be capable of has grown out of fratricide. Whatever political organization men may have achieved has its origin in crime. And so there's a tragic element to revolutions, because they, as beginnings, as problems of beginnings, they are always going to involve an element of violence. Okay. I'm going to stop there. There's obviously much more to be said. And hopefully we can begin to talk amongst ourselves, or at least have some questions. I see there's already some questions on the queue, so I'll just start there. For those of you who are new, there's two ways to ask questions. One is to write them down in the chat boxes, which you'll see on the right of your screen, and the other is to wait, and at a certain moment you can pop in as you wish. The advantage of writing them down is it's a little more easy, but then you hear my voice a lot. And if you'd like to get in, please feel free. Especially if I am saying something and you feel like it's very important, feel free to try and jump in. So the first question is from Steve Ellman. He asks, how can it be that we are separated from the state of nature by an unbridgeable chasm, when clearly we have gone from there to here? Doesn't the state of nature coexist with our present condition sub rosa? Yes. So, okay, an unbridgeable chasm. Yes. I mean, it's not to say that we can't get from there to here, because, as you've rightly said, Steve, we just did. I think the point she's trying to make, and this is a metaphor, it's not a truth, is that you're not going to get there through a kind of development. You're not going to get there through, as I was reading before, simply through cause and effect, or development, or a dialectical movement. It's not something that's just going to happen on its own. A revolution requires a kind of break, and it requires a kind of leadership. One of the, in my mind's most important metaphors that Arendt employs in all of her writing and relates to this question of revolution is the metaphor of authority dying in the street. She says that there are revolutionary situations. And a revolutionary situation for Arendt is a situation in which the political authority of the period has lost its authority. And it's at a time in which people simply no longer accept the authorities of the time. They no longer respect them. And they are ready, really ready, to follow someone to a new course. But that doesn't mean, whenever there's a revolutionary condition or revolutionary situation, that doesn't mean there will be a revolution. In fact, Arendt says in a number of places, in most cases where you have a revolutionary condition or situation, there won't be a revolution. And the reason there won't be is because there's not someone or some group of people who are able to pick the power up as it's lying in the street and reconstitute it. She, writing in the 1960s, she says, look, we're clearly in a revolutionary situation. The country has lost its faith in the power structure and the authority of the country. And this is speaking in the United States, but not just in the United States, throughout much of Western Europe. The whole 1968 student movements and revolutionary movements were a reaction to a very real problem and a very real phenomena, which is that power and the power of the elites, the power of the governments, had really broken down, and it was lying in the street, and all someone needed to do was pick it up. And I know some of you read the interview on the revolutionary tradition at the end of Crises in the Republic with me of, I don't know, probably about a year ago. But in that essay, she says, the problem is that the people who style themselves the revolutionary leaders are spouting old truisms and cliches about communism and socialism and third worldism that don't in any way speak to the majority, or at least a large enough part of the population, that they would ever follow those people and build a new revolutionary tradition of freedom. And so the result is, because these leaders are stuck in old cliches and are not speaking to the truth of the matter now, and they haven't done what she says is a real analysis of power now, they're not able to pick that power that's lying in the street ready for the picking up. And so I guess this is a long way to answer your question, Steve, but when you say, doesn't the pre-revolutionary situation, the state of nature, exist in the here? Yes, but it's not going to just happen. It requires a leader. And if you're uncomfortable with the leader principle, it requires leadership. It requires some thinking people who are going to articulate a new vision that will reconstitute power and thus reconstitute freedom in a meaningful way. And that's what's missing. And so it's not that it's an unbridgeable chasm. It's that the chasm is only going to be bridged if somebody picks up the power and reimagines what power is today, and in a sense builds the bridge, but the bridge isn't going to emerge on its own. So Steve, if you want to respond to that, happy to do that, but I'll move on. Bob Meyerson asks, when reading Arendt, I'm often puzzled by the, for want of a better word, nature of her argument. is, or to what extent what she asserts descriptive or prescriptive. Now, this is always an issue. With respect to her characterizing the aim of a revolution as freedom, what are we to make of the Nazi seizure of power, if not a revolution or counter-revolution? The Nazis upset what had been an evolving tradition of Western European government for decades, if not longer. Okay, so clearly, in calling revolutions and saying that revolutions strive and aspire for freedom, as Bob says, on the one hand, she's describing the French and the American revolutionaries at their beginning, how they talked about freedom. And they imagined that the only thing, and she says both of these groups of revolutionaries were fairly conservative. They didn't want to tear down everything, but they were led to that step by step by the need to found freedom. And so they were actually, and this is an important point in her understanding of revolutions and revolutionaries. Revolutions are not led by people who want to tear things apart. They're led by people who want to build things. It's the foundation of freedom that Arendt talks about. It's building of institutions, lasting institutions, meaningful institutions of freedom. Not just tearing them down. What leads revolutionaries to engage in violence and tear things down is that that's what's required in order to build freedom. And they are led to it almost against their wills. That's the description she offers of the American and French revolutions. Was that prescriptive? And Bob offers what I take to be a counterexample of the Nazis. Now, I don't think anywhere that I know of, Arendt calls the Nazis a revolutionary party. Now, that's not an answer to Bob's question, because one could simply say they were, whether she called it that or not. So clearly she doesn't think they were. What does she think they were? She thinks they were a totalitarian movement seeking not freedom, but total domination and world domination. So that brings in the prescriptive element. Well, isn't that just a definitional thing, right? Why should we say revolutions only seek freedom and not also seek total domination? And to a certain extent, the answer has to be, well, that's how she understands revolutions. But I don't think it's as cynical as that. That's how the revolutionaries at the beginning of the revolutionary age understood revolutions. And when the word revolution emerged, that's what it came to mean. Now, one thing I'm not sure of, and I'm happy to have someone who knows more about it than I am tell me, is I don't know of the Nazis calling themselves a revolutionary party. If they did, and it's very well they may have, we could say that there's then a disagreement and a contestation over what the word revolutionary means between someone like the Nazis and someone like Hannah Arendt. But she's not. She doesn't think of the Nazis as a revolutionary movement and party. Bob, do you want to add to that or respond in some way? So Gary writes, as a response to the Steve Eldman question, I have what I call the two worlds hypothesis, which addresses this topic. The two worlds hypothesis usually comes from Martin Luther. Is that who we're referring to here? But Martin Luther says that there's the world of God and the world of humans. One is geared towards truth and justice, and one is geared towards order and law. That's at least in philosophy, the usual expression of the two worlds. Gary, I think you may have something else in mind. You want to add to that?
Yes, thanks, Roger. I actually bit on Steve's question and went off a little bit from, I think, what he was talking about in terms of state of nature, because what I really think is a helpful way of thinking about things is to think about two worlds in this sense. There is the world into which we are born, the natural world, a world in which, in fact, uh, everything is predetermined by laws over which we have no control. We can learn about them and deal with them, but the laws of nature state inevitabilities. E equals mc squared, or the law of gravity, whatever you want to say. In the natural world, there isn't freedom of a human type. However, we live in a world which we construct within that overall world of nature, and within that world, there is, in fact, potentially immeasurable freedom, because anything is possible. And really, dreams can come true and nightmares can come true. And for instance, the Nazis, it seems to me, were a nightmare, a possible world that was horrible, but that in fact we had the freedom to create such a world. And the American Revolution, which I just loved your introduction today, Roger, because that is why I love Arendt, is because of On Revolution. It was the first book I ever read of hers. And I was an American history college student at the time I read it, and was a draft resistor, etc. I believe that in our human world, our ability to create new things, truly new things that never existed before, depend on us understanding that the way we do that is through prescription, through giving ourselves written instructions about what we want to do collectively. And that when we start thinking about that in those two world terms, we understand we have to obey the laws of nature so we don't end up with Hurricane Harvey and Irma. And we need to realize our incredible power to create a world that reaches our highest aspirations, to which there is no limit in this human political world, because it is a world of politics. So that is my two worlds hypothesis in a brief thing. And I just, Hannah Arendt is, in my opinion, such a wise person for all ages. But as you said in your introduction to today's talk, particularly for today.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That's really helpful. I mean, and what Gary said is really right. This idea that Arendt has, and forget Arendt for a second, there's the idea that what human freedom is an extraordinary potential to do great good and great evil. Right? I mean, go back to Milton, saying where the devil says you can stand, or you can, or the God says to the devil, you can stand or you can fall. Right? You can either do great things, have knowledge, or you can fall and be sinful, and that's what human freedom is. And Arendt is, when people often ask me why Arendt matters or what is Arendt all about, the first thing I will say is she is someone who who fundamentally believes that human freedom um, is the most beautiful and most powerful force in the world, and that we consistently run away from that freedom, and uh, and that her philosophy, her thinking, is about um, uh, creating institutions that allow that freedom to thrive without being as dangerous as it often can be. And I just want to point out one or two things. Very early in this book, I mean, on page 2, and very, she says, we run away from freedom. Freedom is under assault today, and this is one of her fundamental insights about the modern age. And she says there are three reasons at least that freedom is under assault. One is the social sciences, right? Now, a lot of us may be social scientists. I don't want to insult anybody. But she is very critical throughout her work of the social sciences. At Bard, by the way, it's very interesting. We don't have a faculty of social sciences. We have a faculty of social studies. And the reason is because her husband, Heinrich Blücher, taught at Bard for many years and insisted that the social studies be used instead of social sciences because he didn't want the study of mankind to be made into a science in the sense of a natural science. The argument here, and some of those of you who know German, there's a difference between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, natural sciences and the human or spiritual science. And for Arendt, it is a huge mistake to set human beings and human action under the scientific search for norms and rules, which is what positive social science often seeks to do. Because what it does is it says that human beings are predictable, understandable, and knowable, and it takes away their freedom. And it's this attempt to understand and study humans according to rules and regularities, which is one of the great dangers to human freedom. She ties that to what she calls the greatest threat to human freedom in the human condition, the law of large numbers. The idea that as we live in ever larger societies and social groups with large numbers, we can increasingly predict human behavior because people do act on a bell curve, and we can know how many people are going to drive on this day and how many people are going to study.
The sound is having trouble, Roger.
I'm sorry?
You're having trouble with the sound. Your voice is coming through in a odd way. I don't know if it's just me or anybody else.
Okay, is this any better, Pat? Okay, thanks for letting me know. The idea is that the law of large numbers with the bell curve allows us to predict and understand human behavior, and it thus makes human action, which would be truly free and spontaneous and unexpected, ever more rare. And so we actually lose our respect for humans. That's an amazing statement she wants to make. We lose our respect because humans become regularized. They cease to do surprising and great things. Everything becomes, oh, that's expected. We expect a certain number of people to be artists. We expect a certain number of people to be rebels. We expect a certain number of people to drive Volkswagen Beetles and others to drive Porsches and others to drive electric Teslas. And nothing becomes surprising or free. It becomes just part of the expected scatter graph or bell curve. So that's the second, that's the first way that freedom is under assault for her. The second, she says that it becomes a lower middle class prejudice. And this, I think, is something that a lot of us need to think about. Freedom becomes something that we think sort of petit bourgeois people believe they have. And you saw this in the election controversies last year. There was an argument about whether Hillary Clinton had said something along the lines of people who are well off or who are successful, it's not because of what they did, it's because of social forces, right? And there's a sense among many intellectuals and many scientists and social scientists that our successes and our achievements are not based in freedom, but based in nurture and our inheritance, both biological and monetary and intellectual and social structures, and that therefore people shouldn't get credit for what they do. And this is a second way in which freedom, she says, is under assault. So the point is, and then the third is that in the demand for equality, which is not simply political equality, but social equality or economic equality, we say that people are equal even when they're not. And for her, this is another way in which the overarching drive for equality, when it's misplaced in certain ways, can attack and undermine freedom. So I just wanted to respond to Gary by saying these are real issues that she's fighting, and I think I'm agreeing with Gary. I hope, but these are issues that she's fighting and cares deeply about, and that are going to be discussed throughout this book as we move forward into it. Pat, are you hearing me better now?
Yes. Yes, I am, Roger.
Good. Again, if people need to respond immediately, you can.
Could I make a point as long as I've interrupted you once?
As long as, yes.
On the analytics, on the political science, I noticed there's some people who thought that the Clinton campaign relied too much on analytics and not enough on touching the people, the real issues that the people were feeling. They were, putting people into categories and making the assumptions you described, and it didn't work out that way in the end for them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big problem. I mean, there's a lot of issues here. I don't want to go into them all politically, but there's a number of political analysts who say that we should talk less about policy and more about feelings and emotions. I'm sure some of you have been following the debate around Mark Lilla's new book on identity politics, and the question of whether we should be talking about identities or trying to speak to larger national policy and a sense of who the we are. And there's problems with that on both sides. But these are issues we can continue to talk about as we read this book, and I hope you'll ask questions about them. I want to go through some of these other questions that have come up, and we'll see. Peter Reed asks, he has a question about the distinction between liberty and freedom. Yeah, this is actually a central distinction in the book and in Arendt's writing, and she'll talk a lot more about it again in the next chapter, Peter, on the meaning of revolution. But to give you a preface to it, and it will actually help when you're reading the next chapter, I hope, because it's an absolutely essential distinction. Liberty for her is something like liberation from a monarch, or liberation from a tyrant, or liberation from an authoritarian regime. So that, just to put it in very clear terms, the war against England for the United States was a war of liberation. It was not a war of freedom. Freedom is something else. Freedom means the foundation of institutions and a world in which we can act freely. And what does acting freely mean for her? Well, it means, and this goes back to chapter 9 of The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she's talking about what the right to have rights are. It's the right to speak and act meaningfully in a political community, to be recognized as someone who has meaning, who, when they speak and act, other people listen to because your voice can matter. And so freedom for her is always going to mean something like being in a public world where one has the potential to act and speak in ways that people will listen to you and in ways that matter. And so she says that the American Revolution was originally a war of liberation, but it only became a revolution that led to freedom when those institutions and that institutional freedom was solidified. There are different ways we can date that, and in all honesty, dating it exactly is not very important to me. But I think one way to date it, she talks about the fact that even before the revolution, there was already, at least in New England, town councils and this idea of public government. But I think in her work, she says that there was a point when the United States Constitution became worshipped almost like a religion. And we could almost say that it's at that point when the Constitution, which established a foundation for free government, became worshipped as a religion, that she might say the United States Revolution finally existed. Okay. I'm not sure. Steve Ellman writes, she makes use of the word normal. Standing on a street corner waiting for no one is power. Is that a reference, Gregory Corso, Steve? I don't know that reference. Can you say more about your question, Steve? I'm not sure I understand it. If you're there. All right. Does anyone else have some thoughts or a question at this point? I know this is a short text. Maybe it was too easy.
I have maybe a question. Can you hear me?
I hear somebody, but they're very light. Can you speak up or?
It's me, Peter. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So yeah, back to the issue of freedom. Let's see. So what was it? The idea that you mentioned it, and it's in this text about the only sort of so that the Deus ex machina, right, in an age of nuclear war is what? Freedom, right? Freedom serves as the only justification for war, right? In an era when the stakes are as high as they are, right? So in other words, as you were saying, no piece of land or whatever can be a justification, but freedom can, right? Why is that? Is this back to what we were saying about because freedom now having this religious, a zealotry? Are we talking about freedom because it's now something like religious rather than, realpolitik kind of pragmatism? We need this land, but if you're zealous for freedom, you are more likely to risk more because the hunger for it is fundamentally, irrational or passionate or something like that. Is that what makes it more likely that freedom will be the cause of war in an age of nuclear war?
Peter, that's a great question, and it's the kind of question that, in a sense, one can only answer by trying and saying this. What she says is, people have been fighting for freedom for millennia, thousands and thousands of years. It's the part of what she's saying is that freedom is a deep human need.
This is like the neocon kind of, right? Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually really important, right? There are people throughout her life who called Hannah Arendt a neocon. They weren't used the term neocon, but she was her critique of her critique of totalitarianism not only attacked the Nazis, but attacked the Soviets, right? And part of that was her insight that the Soviets' attempt to create a bureaucratized world of equality was as large a threat to spontaneity and freedom as was the Nazis. A lot of liberals in the 60s thought Hannah, I meet people today still who says, wasn't she that neocon who argued against, Stalin, right? Because she was considered that by many people. And she was funded at times by the U.S. government and by some fairly shady U.S. government organizations. I forget the name of it, the Committee on Freedom or something like that, which funded a lot of conservative writers. Well, because she was an anti-communist, she got funding from some of that. I mean, she was certainly distanced from them in many ways. But and so I want to acknowledge that, and I think we should have an honest conversation about it. I don't think she's a neocon in any meaningful sense.
Right, but just meaning that like that idea that freedom is innate is the same, right? That's what Bush talked about in order, it's kind of garden variety neoconservative. Right, that's all I mean to say.
Yeah, and part of what I was saying before when I was talking about her worries about the way freedom is under assault is that she thinks liberals, right, whose very name means liberty, which is another word for freedom, have forsaken their heritage. She thinks that the fight of liberals is the fight for freedom, and that to the extent that liberals have forgotten that, they are they're making a mistake and they're losing the power of their discourse. To add one element to it, this is sort of a fascinating side of Hannah Arendt. She cites throughout her life biologists who are interested in studying morphology, the study of forms. And one of the things she talks about is how all living things desire to appear. They want to be seen. They want to be public. They want to be recognized. And so for her, freedom, which is more than just liberty, is the right to have rights, which means the rights to be matter. It's not just the right to be free to starve under the bridge. It's not just the right to be free to not have somebody kill you or have somebody imprison you. It's the right to matter. And that for her is the right to have rights. And I'll go further. It's what makes us human. And it's what makes us human insofar as all living beings have, she thinks, all living beings have a desire to appear. But humans have the unique ability to appear freely, right? Protozoa can appear, and they desire to. They seek to get into the world and survive, the survival of the fittest. But they can't do it freely. They can't build new institutions. And what makes humans different from protozoa, well, what makes us similar is we desire to matter. What makes us different is that we can create ways of mattering in ways that no one had ever thought. Cross Steve's, chasm that he was talking about in the first question, from the state of nature. And that is so important to her. And so as we get into this book, especially in the chapters on the social question, and again in the chapters on public happiness, appearing in public, and the great threat to human freedom is not poverty. This is going to be one of the interesting aspects of her work. It's misery. It's misery and slavery. And so the two things that Arendt is going to say most destroy humanity are misery and slavery, because what they both do is they make people invisible. That's why refugees and the refugee crisis becomes such a central part of her work. Because if you're a refugee and you're stuck in a camp, you are removed from mattering in a meaningful way. And interesting new work on refugee camps by people like Michel Algier and Etienne Guangzhou and others, are trying to say, well, in refugee camps, there's this complete invisibility that Arendt was talking about, and yet there's new ways that our people in these camps are trying to politicize the status of being a refugee, which is actually what Arendt said needed to happen in her essay, We Refugees, right? At the end of that essay, which again, those of you interested, go back and watch the reading group discussion of We Refugees. It's about changing the narrative of refugees from being victims to being a new political force. And that's very much what Arendt is trying to do. So that's not neocon. I just want to be very clear. Her idea of freedom is important. And yes, you're right, there's a neocon element of it. But it's about the empowering and of all people to appear in ways that matter. And that's a very revolutionary idea, I think. And let me say, I don't think all neocons are terrible people. I think a lot of them believe in some of this. I don't want to, say people who are conservative don't. A lot of conservatives are meaningful, principled conservatives, and they believe that we are forsaking freedom in the name of too much equality. And that's a legitimate.
I'm using it pejoratively. I was trying to just use it denotatively. But so yeah.
Yeah, no, but these are good discussions to have, and it's good to bring them out in their fullest form. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob Meyerson writes, HC, I guess human condition. Yes, I'm having trouble. Oh, Hannah Center, Arendt Center. I'm having trouble speaking up when I unmute audio. Nothing's done. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say, Bob. Maybe you could start and restart.
Ignore that, Roger.
Oh, you're called in. Thanks, Bob. Are you there?
There's a further quote by Bob at the bottom of the chat feed if you scroll down.
Okay. Let me just go in order so that I'll do Johanna and then Bob. I see Johanna, I'm sorry, I should know that. Arendt also says that political freedom can only exist in a limited space, which should mean that it is not to be available to some groups. I find this troubling since it seems it ought to be universal. It is a break with the liberal democratic tradition. It seems rather pessimistic view. Okay, it's, I think, different to say that it can only exist in a limited space, which she does say, than to say that it can't exist for some groups, right? I was just using the idea of refugees, right? And some people have interpreted Arendt's ideas about the right to have rights as to say that everyone has to belong to a state, right? That's actually one of the real, Jacques Rancière and others, that's one of the real mistaken views of reading Hannah Arendt. She never says the right to have rights is the right to belong to a state. She says the right to have rights is to belong to a political community. What is a political community? Okay, it could be a state, but it's any community in which you can act and speak in ways that matter. And one of her problems with refugees is that they are excluded from political community and from acting and speaking in ways that matter. But I think there's a perfectly legitimate Arendtian response to that, is that refugees can organize, and in doing so, imagine themselves as a political community. And that is beginning to happen. I think the refugee crisis in the last year has shown that to be happening. And refugees are seeking a voice and engaging in the world. And so I don't think there's any group that Arendt would exclude from being able to pursue freedom. What she does says, and this is where you're right, Johanna, is that any group, any universalist idea, any truly internationalist idea is likely to diminish freedom because you need some you need a space in which you can appear. And if the space is so big and so internationalist and so cosmopolitan, we lose that voice. And so for those of us interested, again, in the European question or the American question or politics today, so much of the rejection of cosmopolitan, the rejection of the European Union, many of the people who vote for Donald Trump, many of the people in Catalan who are arguing against Spain, what they're saying is our voice is being lost in these larger bureaucratic administrative units. And we don't want to be part of some EU bureaucracy. We want to be part of a community that we understand and that we feel we have a voice in. And this, of course, raises questions of a kind of ethnic primariness or national primariness or racial primariness. And these are important responses to have. But Hannah Arendt makes a distinction in her work between a nation state and a state. It's a key distinction that not many people today decide to make anymore. But a state is simply a non-national state in which any group can have citizenship rights and therefore appear in public. A nation state is one in which there is a majority group that has privileges and a privileged appearance. And when she came to the United States in 1941, her first number of letters back to Europe are all in shock that as a Jew, she could actually have a voice in the United States. She had never experienced that before. And she says the United States isn't a nation state. It's a state in which any group and any person, as still a member of that group, could still appear. Now, there were limits to that. Blacks, African Americans being one, Native Americans being others. And in a lot of her writing, and including in this book, we're going to read a lot about that. She says the slavery question was the great sin and the potentially destructive sin of the American experience, because what it did is it made an entire people invisible. But she doesn't think that has to be the case. And I think this, and we'll talk more about this when we read these sections. But I mean, there's a debate going on in the United States today about whether the American creed is inherently racist and therefore needs to be done away with, or whether it's flexible enough to include all different people in it. And I think that's she obviously, I don't say obviously, I think she believes it's flexible enough to expand, but she's aware enough of the horror of the experience of slavery and the exclusion of Black Americans, that she's aware that overcoming that problem is going to take enormous efforts. And that's something I think we'll have to talk about as we continue to read this book. Because as I said, there's an American exceptionalist angle to this book, and yet it's one that's also deeply aware of the problems and limitations of that American creed, if you're willing to go with me on that words. So, I mean, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others have argued we have to give up the American creed in some way. Whereas others would say, no, we need to expand it. And I think that's a meaningful debate. It may be the most important debate in America today. I see Peter nodding on my screen. I don't know how, Johanna, do you want to add anything? Or Peter? I mean, these are obviously important political issues today.
No, I think that is the fault line, right? The idea of how did you just put it? Expanding what we already have versus something new. A radical critique versus a liberal critique or whatever. But that just seems like what everything's about right now.
Right. Okay. Bob writes, returning to the earlier discussion of power laying in the street. When the government has lost its authority, one of the problems with the protests against the war during the 60s and 70s is that although the Johnson and Nixon administrations have lost their authority in the eyes of many, the protesters had no governmental alternative, only a policy alternative, which drove many of us crazy because the zombie government couldn't accommodate the protest. All we could do was jump up and down until our government became exhausted and called it quits. Yeah, well, Bob, that's why you're still reading Hannah Arendt. I mean, that was her critique, right? I mean, she, on the one hand, said that the protests were the most hopeful sign in American politics in decades, and she really embraced the students and the protesters, and talked about how this showed that students weren't just materialistic and cynical, and that they actually cared. And yet she was deeply critical of the protests and the students and the leaders of the protests and the students, because she thought they weren't doing the work of articulating a meaningful alternative vision of government. I think a lot of us felt the same way about Occupy Wall Street a couple of years ago. And I think some people feel that way about the Tea Party, although the Tea Party has articulated a more meaningful government philosophy. It's one that a lot of people don't agree with, but at least in my world. But they at least are articulating a governmental alternative, whereas the Occupy Wall Street protests really refused to do so, out of a sense that and this was an articulated sense by people like David Graeber and Simon Critchley, which is that freedom in government is no longer possible because all government is oppressive, and therefore the only way to be free is to protest, to push back. This has become a common view on the left, that freedom is not an institutional experience; it's a protesting and an anarchic experience. And that's where someone like Hannah Arendt really does disagree with people like Rancière. Rancière says all police, all policy is oppressive. Arendt doesn't, and that is a meaningful difference between them. One of the, as I was mentioned, I think I was talking to Peter when I said it before, but Arendt was not a communist, and she's not a socialist. And she says in a number of places, liberals who are afraid of totalitarianism should also be afraid of bureaucratic communism, right? This is, and so she's not a social democrat in that sense. I mean, she believes in the welfare state, but she doesn't want a large bureaucratic institution. And so one of the ways that I think an Arendtian critique of much of the politics of the left right now would be that if you're actually, look, we've tried socialism and communism for the last 120, 140 years in the West. It's never worked in a way that hasn't led to totalitarianism. You need to come up with some new ideas. And I think her view is that, unfortunately right now, whenever power is in the streets, and which I think it is right now, undoubtedly around the Western world, the left falls back into a new kind of communism or social democracy. And it doesn't think about new forms of articulating what it means to institutionalize freedom. And that would be Arendt's critique of the left, at least one of them, not the only one. She has a critique of the right too, right? Which is, you have to still care about equality. You have to still provide people with basics, and you have to articulate freedom, not in a kind of neocon libertarian way, but in a way that actually provides people with a voice and recognition in a political sphere. And that goes to Johanna's question. Anyone want to respond or comment on that? So I have a question from Lee. What of alt-right groups claiming that they are not allowed to speak or matter in the public sphere? Well, I think, some of you have been involved in this reading group for a while, so you've heard me say this. There's a lot of similarities between Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, and there's a lot of similarities between the anti-Fas and the alt-right. That's not to equate them, right? I don't want to get into this, they're the same, and call me Donald Trump or anything like that. I'm not saying that. There's differences, but there's a similarity, which is that there has been, since the 1950s, a strong establishment voice that governed this country. And it wasn't Democrat or Republican. It was sort of the middle of both. And it really did control many of the means of expression and many and much of the newspapers. And it was largely liberal, especially since the 1960s and 70s. And it was but it didn't give voice to people on the far left and people on the far right, and also people who were in identity groups, whether it's transgender or racial groups or others that felt that they were not part of that mainstream culture. And what we're seeing now with the rise of technology, which has just made it absolutely easy to have a voice and impossible to shut it up and impossible to have any voice be authoritative, because no matter what authoritative voice there is, this is an absolute rule of all authoritative voices, they simplify their narrative. Well, once you can check the narratives on the internet, you can find that any narrative has been simplified, and you can criticize it and you can delegitimize it. And so one of the real problems we have in the 21st century is we may have hit a technological point in which no public authority can assert itself, because any public narrative can now be criticized by dozens and dozens of different positions that show the simplification in a way that hurts them. And this is actually an argument made by someone named Martin Gurry, who will be speaking at our conference, Crises of Democracy, in October. And he has a book called The Revolt of the Public, which I highly recommend to you if you're interested in pursuing that technological approach to that question. But I think you're right. I mean, Matt Drudge, not someone I usually cite, is known to have said that the reason he started the Drudge Report, really in many ways the first alt-right publication, although there was no alt-right back then, was that he said that they wouldn't let us play in their sandbox, so we built our own. Well, I mean, what we now have is dozens of sandboxes around the country. And I think all of them feel disenfranchised and disempowered. And this is part of the Mark Lilla debate about identity politics, and we should all be very aware of it. I mean, what Mark Lilla is saying is, how can you create a constitutional American idea if everyone's saying, this is my point, this is my point, this is my point, and no one's saying this is we, this is our point? And he's got a point, right? I mean, he's not the first person to say this. On the other side, who gets to say who we is, right? I mean, and what we have right now is a situation in which there is no public voice around the country who is able to articulate a we in the United States of America in a way that is persuasive to a large plurality of Americans. And that's a situation we're in. We need somehow, we're in need of that voice. Where it will come from, who it might be, I have no idea. But it strikes me that until someone emerges who can do that, we're still going to be in a holding pattern for a long time in this country. And that's where I see things being fought over. Jordan writes, I really think the difference between the neocon freedom and Arendt's freedom lies in the freedom versus liberty distinction. Where the neocon freedom fails is that it conflates the two and views personal liberty as the same thing as freedom. So to the extent neocons are libertarians, Jordan, I think that would be a fair point. I'm not sure all neocons are libertarians. A lot of them have a very strong sense of American identity, and they want everybody to subscribe to a, there was some of you may have heard there was a controversial article published op-ed in the in the Pennsylvania Inquirer like a week and a half ago by a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania and someone out in California, and they argued that we have to stop saying that all cultures are equal and admit that the sort of bourgeois culture that emerged in the 1950s in the United States, where people were honest and they worked hard and they married and had kids, was actually a superior culture, and that that's the culture that made America great, and we should be honest and say that that's the culture. Well, I mean, I think that it is important to say that there are good things that we like when people are honest and people are trustworthy and people work hard, and these are part of a cultural norm that we actually want to support. But the bourgeois culture of the 1950s, and excuse me, I mean, it had some other parts to it that are not included in that, and we need to be honest about that as well. And so I think that there are a lot of what you call Jordan neocons who would be completely happy with what I just said and said, of course, I don't mean that. I just mean we need to articulate a vision of American freedom. And then I can, okay, I'm a neocon. Don't quote me. But the point is, there's also others, right? There's another view, right? And I think Mark Lilla, who's someone very interesting guy, is a voice we should address. On the one hand, he's talking about he's a liberal. On the other hand, he's talking about we need to speak in a we, and that there's some sort of a universal American we. I agree with him to the extent that we have to speak in a we, and I think we have to aspire to it, but I don't know what it is. And it has to happen organically. It has to grow up. It can't be imposed top down. And part of what's going on right now is we don't have a we, and we're seeing a huge national conversation about who the we is, and people are fighting over it. And I agree with Mark Lilla that this fight is destructive, and it's actually threatening to tear the country apart, and it's upsetting a lot of people who don't see the problem and therefore are feeling resentful that they're being excluded from America. All of that I agree with. But the struggle to acquire that we is going to take time and energy and listening to lots of people who don't normally get listened to. Okay, now they're being listened to, but in groups, not by everybody. And that's sort of what's going on. But we can't just listen to someone and say, oh, because you haven't been listened to, now you're right. And they have to listen to us. And that's the goal. That's our politics. That's our challenge for the next, I don't know how long it's going to take. It's going to take a while. I don't anticipate this being solved in the next 10 years. The last person that I can think of in the United States who really had a voice that I think unified a large percentage of the country was Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, you could make the argument that Ronald Reagan did to some degree, right? I mean, they're different voices, but Ronald Reagan spoke to a wide range of people and spoke to a lot of people who were in the other political party and brought them over to his. But those are the last two that are even, I think, in the running of people who spoke to a group, an American we that was beyond their base. And, King was 60 years ago, and Reagan was almost 40 or 30-something, 40 years ago. We need someone who's able to speak across that divide right now. And obviously we haven't found it, which is why we're getting partisan people on each side and breaking things apart. Harold writes, Bridgeport, Connecticut is notable for having had a socialist mayor for 24 years. Jasper McLeavy served as mayor from 1933 to 1957. The years of it being one of the most successful cities in the economic, cultural, and political realms. Okay, there is no doubt that, small socialist communities of like-minded people can be successful. The kibbutz movement in Israel is one example of that. Vermont, which is not, at least at that point, not a haven of diversity, can be another moment of that. There are utopian communities throughout history that have been deeply successful for a time, and maybe for longer. I don't want to say that that's not, but we live in a multicultural, multi-religious, multiracial, widely unequal society. And how do we create such a political world that's successful? And let me say, there's a difference between being successful and being free. I'm not saying Vermont wasn't free. I don't know. But there's a tendency amongst socialist and social democratic governing elites to elite governance. It doesn't have to be the case. I don't want to say that you can't have a kind of, in Russia, you had the Soviets that were emerged at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. And as Arendt says, I think in her essay or book on violence, it could be in another book, I'll have to look. Lenin at one point said at the very beginning of the revolution, what our revolution stands for is industrialization plus the Soviets. And 5 years later, the Soviets dropped out and it was just industrialization. Does it have to be that way? No, I'm not trying to say it does. I don't think she would say it does. But there is something about socialism which has, despite its claim to speak for the working person, has over and over again become an elite bureaucratic movement. Why that's the case is an interesting question. I'm happy to, talk about it. We're going to talk about it more as we read this book. But there's no doubt that at least in Arendt's experience in the 1960s, when she's writing this book, socialism had not succeeded in being a movement for freedom. It had succeeded in being a movement for equality and eventually bureaucratic domination, which she worried about. Gary writes, Jordan writes, that's a fair point. I guess I was thinking more directly of the libertarian side, right? We were talking about that. Gary writes, it will take until we do it or until the world ends, whichever comes first. Gary, you're always optimistic. Bob writes, I think you hit it, Roger, when you paraphrase Mark Lilla's position as rightfully critical of identity political. I'm a line reminds me of the apocryphal Hog sisters. I'm a hog and you're a hog. I love that, Bob. I had never heard that before. I'm a hog and you're a hog, the sisters. That's funny. Yeah, I'll let the joke stand.
Roger,
Jennifer,
one of them was
yeah.
real. They were daughters of a Texan magnate, but I don't remember if it was Ima or Yura.
So there was a magnate named Hog, and he named his daughters Ima, and then one of them, and then someone else said Yura, or
vice versa. I think so.
It's like my father's neighbor who were the Lights, and they named their kids Star and Twy. Yeah. No, I mean, look, the critique of identity politics. Look, you all have your views, and I don't want to, I'm just telling you from an Arendtian point of view, and I'm going to try and speak from that point of view, which is not to say that I speak for Arendt, but I'm trying to speak from my understanding of an Arendtian point of view. Identity politics is fine insofar as it's seeking recognition for a collective voice. But for Arendt, it also, in a federal republic, constitutional republic, needs to also be able to speak for all of us and make a claim to speak for all of us. And if we just speak from our own point of view, then it's always I'm a hog or you're a hog. And so from her point of view, it's not that all identity politics is wrong, because there are identities that matter, and identities are part of what it means to be human. And we don't want to discredit that. But we have to somehow, if we're going to be part of a larger country, learn to speak as Americans, whatever that may be. And that's the challenge. Jennifer writes, speaking across the divide is important, but I would add that the lack of women in this voice of we comes from our history of a male narrative. It's important that in listening that we must do, that women are not treated as a subset to the male we. Jennifer, look, as I said, I think identities are important. And yet we also should remember that there is no, each identity can then become essentialist. I mean, this is a funny thing that happens to me every year, but I teach my courses, and this happened at least 2 or 3 times where colleagues of mine had said, Roger, you don't teach any women. And I said, I teach Hannah Arendt. And they go, oh, well, she doesn't count. And I'm like, okay, but what makes a woman, right? I mean, this becomes an issue because she's not a feminist in the sense of some people. Does she not a feminist? Is she not a woman? We all saw this with the Women's March that happened earlier this year. The Women's March called itself a Women's March, but wouldn't allow people who were pro-life to march with pro-life banners, even though they were women. What do we make of that? And I raise this, Jennifer, not as a critique. I think you're absolutely right. We need more women voices. I take that very seriously. I take it seriously in what I think, in what I write, and also when as I organize a lot of public conferences and public events. I really do make an effort to bring in a wide range of voices. But what I've learned over time is that you can bring up, no matter how diverse your panel is, people are going to say my view's not there, right? And it was a great moment last year where we had 4 African Americans on stage, and someone said there's no Hispanics. And one of them got up and said, look, you guys don't even know how much diversity is on the stage. 2 of us are gay, 2 of us are not, 2 women, 2 men. One of us is a conservative African American, one's moderate, 2 liberal. The amount of diversity on this stage at that moment was extraordinary, and yet it wasn't diverse enough. And so, not to say, I'm not trying to disagree with what Jennifer's saying. I agree with her 100%. But we've reached a point right now where at times we identify people and say, you are X, and that's essentializing, and we know that's sort of bad, but it's much more than that. What I tell my students all the time is listen to people, because even the people you disagree with, you're going to be surprised at how much you agree with. I mean, we're not all our boxes, and we need to get beyond that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't hear women and all sorts of different voices, and I'm certainly in a full agreement with that. And then we have the biography of I'm a Hog. I am gonna leave it at that. It's 2:30. This has been a good conversation. Again, this was a very short first chapter, but we got into a lot of things that will come back as we continue to read the book. I hope you find that. So for next session, which is in 2 weeks, we're going to be reading this first chapter on the meaning of revolution. And I really hope you enjoy it. Let me just give you a little heads up. I'll send out obviously a reading about it, but sections 1 and 2 are really the meat of this section. It's divided into 5 sections. So if you're breaking up your reading, that's where I would focus. But 3, 4, and 5 are important as well, and I'll provide an introduction by early next week to get you reading. Thank you all. Look forward to reading with you next time. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.
Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks a lot.